Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jamie Curcio with Curcio Web. Curcio Web is an employee benefits consulting organization. We are woman-owned as certified by the WBENC, and we've been in business for about 25 years.
Hello, I'm Elliot Raff with McDonald Hopkins. McDonald Hopkins is a full-service business advisory and advocacy law firm with more than 150 attorneys across the country and offices in 5 strategic locations. Over the course of the firm's 90-year history, McDonald Hopkins has earned a reputation as a proactive and innovative law firm, providing insightful legal solutions and meaningful business advice for our clients' challenges at hand and for those on the horizon.
Today, I'm joined by Brian Denon of Curcio Web and Elliot Raff from McDonald Hopkins. We're going to share our take on cybersecurity and how it impacts plan sponsors. Brian, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Brian Denon. I lead up Curcio Web's retirement administration practice. I've been working on retirement administration for approximately 30 years, 7 years on the provider side and 23 years with Curcio Web.
And Elliot, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Elliot Raff. I'm a member of McDonald Hopkins law firm, and I'm in the employee benefits and ERISA practice group. I've been working exclusively in the employee benefits and ERISA legal side for 30 years with government, private practice, and in-house and industry, and very happy to join you today.
In April of last year, the Department of Labor issued 3 pieces of informal guidance relating to cybersecurity and defined contribution plans. If you search for DOL Cybersecurity Guidance, you can find the details pretty easily. There have been countless emails, podcasts, articles, and webinars on this topic, and I think the 3 of us have taken a little different spin on this. We chose to discuss specific action steps to prevent problems and what you need to consider moving forward as a plan sponsor. Your responsibility is much greater than checking the box one time. And as a plan sponsor, you shouldn't rely on your providers to ensure that you're meeting your fiduciary obligations. Elliot, we know how important it is to assess the strength of a provider's cybersecurity program at the time a service provider is selected. Can you share what types of questions should be included in a search process?
Yeah, happy to. The very first question is not outward facing, and it's obvious once I say it, but is often or very often overlooked, which is whether I, the plan sponsor or the plan fiduciary, do I have the expertise to evaluate cybersecurity procedures? As data and information and documentation come in, it needs to be reviewed and evaluated by someone who knows what they're looking at and knows how to evaluate and assess it against appropriate standards. I'm a lawyer. I don't know anything about cybersecurity. I'm not going to be in a position to evaluate whether this is meaningful or ridiculous. So I need to get expertise. I need to get help. So maybe I call to my own internal IT department, and they have someone who has that expertise and ability to help me, to explain things to me, but also to review the materials and be an integral part of the process. And if I don't have that, or I'm not able to get that internal resource, I'm going to go outside and hire a consultant, again, to sit beside me and help me understand what's coming in and make sense of it and give me an objective evaluation of it. So that's critical. Then you get into the specifics as to what data standards does the provider follow? What are their procedures for training, for oversight, for implementing the standards, for implementing changes to the standards as they evolve, for testing their compliance with the standards and their own internal procedures, for training staff, for overseeing staff, et cetera, et cetera. Every aspect from what the standard is all the way through to maintaining and continuing to live with that standard.
And Elliot, can you talk about some of the items that should be included in a sound provider contract to really ensure DOL cybersecurity compliance?
Sure, and I would definitely say it's beyond just complying with the DOL, because you genuinely want to protect your plan, your data, your employees. Employers genuinely care, and these are steps to take to protect the huge amount of money that employers put into these plans and that employees put into these plans. So number one, and this probably is obvious once I say it, is indemnification. You want to make sure that you have a very strong indemnification specific to cybersecurity breaches. Ideally, that would also cover account theft, which is when a hacker is basically able to impersonate the participant, take over the account, change the banking information, drain the account, goodbye. Technically, that's a security breach because the data has been breached, but it's not by breaking the system, but just sort of working and navigating through the system. Very complicated topic, but it happens. So does your indemnification cover that? Does the indemnification cover the typical remedies for cybersecurity breach, such as period of credit monitoring and protection against identity theft, etc.? So those are all things that go into indemnification. And then general contract terms to reflect what the provider has said they would do, what standard they follow, that they make the changes as the standard evolves, that they have a certain training schedule, supervision schedule, testing schedule, etc. All of those things that they say they do to various degrees of detail should be written into the contract so that you can hold them accountable for that.
Brian, I know a lot of the work that you do is related to helping clients with their current service agreements. So can you talk about how you've helped organizations revise their current service agreements to include these provisions around cybersecurity and information security standards?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that a lot of the things that we're talking about go beyond just the DOL guidance on 401k plans. That a lot of the language and processes to monitor cybersecurity applies to HSA plans, it applies to pension plans, and organizations really need to think about how those contracts are written to follow very similar processes. So I think most organizations today have a cybersecurity exhibit that most IT departments have put together to cover the issuing of SSAE SOC 2 reports, covering organizations that have GDPR requirements. But where we're spending our focus is on making sure that things like data breach language not only covers what Elliot was referencing in terms of indemnification, but what's going to be the process that these organizations are going to take in the event something happens, and where do their responsibilities fall. We're taking a look at things like compliance with law language. And so today you have a set of DOL regulations, but those are likely going to change and evolve over time. We're looking at things like who are your subcontractors and what are your responsibilities for subcontractors. And then lastly is around security guarantees. And many of the providers have put out language that says we'll make participants' accounts whole, but the question is what goes around that, and what are the caveats? Beyond just that sort of base contract language, there's also a need to have language around ongoing governance. And every provider, as part of their standard contracts, has language that says, we're going to do quarterly monitoring of our services. We're going to report on our performance metrics. But it's important that these practices and their ability to comply with these cybersecurity requirements is part of that. on a quarterly basis, an annual basis, or whatever that defined frequency is, and how are their practices evolving and changing to comply with the ever-changing requirements.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on what Brian mentioned in terms of the participant guarantees, where firms say if there's a breach and your account is taken over, as I was describing, and the money goes off into the Netherlands or goes off into space, they'll make you whole. Oftentimes, you look at the fine print and it says it's subject to whatever state law. So we're not dealing with ERISA, we're dealing with state law, typically where that provider is. And at least in the ones that I've looked at, they all say may be modified, revoked, terminated at any time without notice as they see fit. So I've often thought, what happens if my account is drained and stolen and I'm not aware of it for 2-3 months because I don't look at my account every day? And in that interim, all of a sudden, they've revoked this policy, or they've said, they've modified the policy in some way. Do I have a claim under the old policy when this happened? Do I have a claim under a new policy that's much more restrictive when I learn about it? These are open questions. There are not clear answers. And again, it's a matter of state law. So what's good in Massachusetts may be totally different from something in California or Illinois. And so all of a sudden you don't have that kind of uniformity of expectation and how these things play out. And the guarantees are just not something to rely on. That's your last fallback, right? You don't say, I don't care whether my house burns down because I have homeowners insurance. And you want to protect it from the front end. These are just your very last hope for some protection and coverage. And I've had clients say, oh, I'm not worried because the record keeper's in charge of it and they'll take care of the participant. But then it's not written into their service contract, and their documentation has all these holes throughout them. So the guarantees are definitely important, and you want to know and ask about that and have it, but that's your last step, not your first step of defense.
And you really need to understand what those guarantees and how they're employed, because many of those guarantees are written with either caveats or responsibilities on the participant. And so plan sponsors need to make sure that if there are responsibilities on their participants to take action, that they think about how that's communicated and keeping an eye on what their participants are doing. Right,
for sure. And ultimately, in all these guarantee situations, the vendor is going to do some kind of investigation. They're going to reach some kind of conclusion. There aren't always time frames, so it can take months and months and months. There isn't always transparency, so you don't know what they've looked at or how they've reached their conclusion. So it's really, they're good, but I think in the first instance, they are promotional tools for the vendors, and in the last instance, a potential source of protection.
Elliot, we understand that it is important to monitor providers' cybersecurity program, but can you help us understand what that means? Can you describe what aspects of a provider's program needs to actually be monitored?
Sure. So I think about it the same way as an investment manager, right? You have an investment manager and you get quarterly reports on their performance that has a wide variety of data that you, the fiduciary and sponsor with the consultant, have decided are important. And you get that and you review it and you evaluate it. So similarly here, so the kinds of things Brian was talking about earlier in terms of the contract, that's your agenda for your quarterly review. Whether it's staff training, if they say they're going to have staff training twice a year, then you want to have a report that we did the staff training and 98% of the staff were trained, etc. If there are breaches, you want to know about breaches. You probably even want to know if there are breaches that don't affect your plan or your participants, because it may indicate issues around their general procedures. When they do their annual testing or their annual audit, you want to get some type of summary report on the findings of that audit. The kinds of regularly quarterly and annual reports of information, as Brian was alluding to, that go into the contract, you want to get reported to you, and you want to be able to review it, make sure you understand it. And again, document all your reviews. Yeah.
Brian, can you talk about how Cursia Web's clients are monitoring their cybersecurity programs?
Sure, I'll kind of say that I don't think this has been top of mind for most clients yet. This is an evolving topic, and to this point, I think most of our clients have been relying on the data coming out of their providers in terms of how they've summarized this guidance, or just the SSA 18 reports that they're producing on an annual basis, showing that their systems and processes are without qualifications. Now, I will say that as this evolves, we've been really helping our clients to think beyond just what's in those SOC reports. So, for example, who has access to data? Not only on the provider side, but on the client side. And that's not just the record keeping system, but it's for other applications like reporting and case management and other types of spreadsheets that might be created as part of ongoing administration. Where does data sit at subcontractors, and what type of data do they hold? Is data maintained onshore or offshore or both? And who has access to that from those various locations? And then where is data being passed? So obviously, as part of most record keeping services, data is going to potentially trustees or other third parties. But is that data potentially being passed within the provider to, for example, a retail arm or some other subcontractor or subsidiary of that provider, where you have to worry about how that data is being stored?
Elliot, what do you think is the risk to the plan sponsor for not executing on the items discussed today?
Well, the Department of Labor is investigating on this topic. It's been widely reported, law firms, consulting firms, benefits press, that the Department of Labor has added cybersecurity to its routine plan reviews. It's not a special review, it's part of their routine reviews. The DOL has not published any announcement over this, but I've had conversations with folks at the DOL, and they informally acknowledge, yes, that is true. So agents from the DOL who are showing up on a routine DOL review will be asking for cybersecurity documentation. And it is an extraordinarily lengthy and detailed list of information and documents that the DOL expects fiduciaries to have. Everything from documentation relating to the selection of a provider and contracting with a provider, through the ongoing monitoring, as Brian was alluding to and describing so well. So that's out there. And of course, if the DOL sees a situation that they think is particularly egregious, they can bring legal action. They can remove fiduciaries. They can impose independent fiduciaries, as well as other kinds of sanctions and penalties, all of which can be extremely disruptive. And as Brian said, this hasn't been top of mind. So I think a lot of clients really have not put the attention into this and may be very vulnerable if their friendly local DOL agent happens to show up. And then I would go even beyond that to actual potential financial exposure. If participants' accounts are drained and there isn't a guarantee, or the guarantee is denied, ultimately, those fiduciaries at the company are going to be on the hook and could potentially be held to account for that. because they selected the provider where the loss happened, and they had to oversee the provider where the loss happened. And so, yes, the record keeper is the front line, and they're going to be accountable for their actions or lack of action and diligence, but so too the folks at the company. So there is potential financial exposure in the situation.
These requirements are focused on providers, systems, and processes. So, Brian, beyond the DOL guidelines, what should plan sponsors be thinking about as it relates to cybersecurity? And then in reality, what can they do to decrease the likelihood of a security incident?
Well, I think as a starting point, I think organizations really need to pay attention to, as I mentioned, where data is housed. And I think a lot of the provider focus has been on the record keeping systems. And that is not the only place where data is being housed at providers. So you have case management applications that may contain PII. You have reporting functions, both ad hoc and provider reports that different people may have access to. And then you just may have data that's floating around on laptops that is being used for, maybe calculating a match or being used to perform some data cleanup. So paying attention to all of these other data sources is going to be critically important, because they could be the source of the next data breach. I'll say secondly, as we alluded to on, some of the security guarantees, some of these require organizations and participants to take specific actions, and making sure that participants are taking those actions, or they're having their providers communicate to participants what actions they need to take to better secure themselves, is going to be critically important. But thirdly, and I think a piece that most people haven't really thought of, is that clients have risk. They store data within their servers, or may house data on their laptops, or they may have established a single sign-on connection from their internal systems to a provider. And if you had a bad actor who somehow got access into a client's internal systems and linked out to a provider to access plan assets, then that provider is not going to be on the hook for that. So clients need to look at their own internal procedures and practices, very similar to the requirements that they're putting on their providers.
And I would say in the DOL investigations, they're asking for the documentation, both of the plan sponsors, the employer's internal procedures, as well as procedures of the vendors. And, it's the old adage, right? You have to take care of your own house first and then work out from there.
Elliot, what do you think fiduciaries should do now to reduce their risk if the DOL does show up?
Yeah, so the first thing to do is get educated, right? If you're not familiar with the issues or the guidance, the first step is to educate yourself, understand the issues, understand the guidance and what's out there. That's a fairly easy hurdle. The next step then is really doing an honest assessment of what you have done so far, a retrospective evaluation and assessment. What did you do when you were selecting the provider or renegotiating a contract within the last several years? What have you done in terms of regular oversight? What does your contract say? And we've created a checklist based on the Department of Labor's guidance that's a tool to gather that information. It goes through a series of yes/no questions. Did you, starting with the selection process, did you ask for X, Y, and Z? Yes, no. Does your contract have the following provisions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes, no. Are you monitoring on an ongoing basis? Again, a series of questions, yes, no. And to the extent that you answer in the negative, right, there are the gaps, there are the areas to then work at filling in, whether it's reopening and discussing amending a contract or adding fiduciary oversight on a regular basis. And the other thing, picking up on Brian's comment, is we recommend doing this checklist for every vendor at each step in the process, again, starting with yourself. So this would go to the record keeper. Well, what about their cloud storage? It would go to the trustee. It would go to your payroll company. It would go if you have a separate third-party administrator, et cetera. So you really need to understand all the steps in the process, do this evaluation, and then finally plan to improve your fiduciary process and actually do it.
I'm curious, you talk about providers opening up their contracts, and how willing have providers been to open their contracts, and then how challenging is that process to manage?
I think providers understand that there is this DOL guidance, and they know that it needs to be accounted for. I would say that it probably doesn't go as far as it needs to in some of the areas that we've been talking about, like security guarantees and what kind of documentation you have for ongoing monitoring. So those are areas when you're negotiating a contract, either for the first time or needing to reopen it or upon renewal, that can be challenging and require some expertise.
I'm going to ask each of you this question, but I'll start with Elliot. Elliot, what can you and McDonald Hopkins do to help the organizations listening to this podcast?
So first of all, I mentioned the checklist, and we did do our best to make it user-friendly, but it is complicated, and it is not always obvious what's being asked or how to evaluate what's been done. So certainly we could sit with a client and help them understand the issues, and do that self-assessment in an accurate and thorough way, and then help develop the strategy to improve the fiduciary process through education, but also contract amending if needed, and ongoing quarterly or annual review, and again, documenting all of that process.
From a Curcio Web perspective, we're helping clients through the selection process and renewal process. So we're regularly looking at this language to ensure that it meets the guidance. But probably once you get beyond that, it's really helping clients figure out where does this data reside, and helping organizations think about who has access, who should have access, and where should data be passed. And then really helping clients with this whole monitoring and thinking about where does this fit into the regular standard quarterly or annual governance process that exists between clients and providers.
With that, I'll wrap this up by saying thank you for listening. We do want you to know that we've published the fiduciary checklist on both of our websites, which are curcioweb.com and mcdonaldhopkins.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.